Thank you, Edith. Good morning. We called this press conference today because of two reports that reached the same conclusion. The way the city enforces environmental laws is ineffective. The OIG described it as willful bureaucratic negligence. We call it ineffective by choice. What happened with Hilco is part of a pattern, and that pattern is what I want to talk about now. For this report, we examined 21 years of data provided by the Department of Administrative Hearings. That data includes every environmental violation prosecuted under the Department of Environment and under the Department of Public Health, listing the ordinances violated, the hearing dates, the outcomes, fines. And then we put it in context using city inspection reports, settlement contracts, and emails. I encourage everyone to read the whole thing because there's a lot there to unpack. But for right now, I'm just going to share the high-level findings and what we are recommending to address them. First, when the Department of Environment was dismantled, the total number of violations fell dramatically that were issued. In the 10 years from the beginning of 2002 to the end of 2011, there were twice as many citations as there were in the 11 years from the beginning of 2012 to the end of 2022. And it was even worse for air pollution. Citations for air pollution dropped by 90%. And when those citations were issued, they were mostly dropped. In the last 4 years, 40% of the air pollution citations that were issued went to 3 companies whose business model depends on polluting activities: General Iron, Sims Metal Recycling, and Pullman Innovations. All of those citations were dropped with no admission of liability. What I think is our most shocking finding is that the city intentionally stops issuing tickets for repeated violations. Just take a moment to think about how different that is from what ordinary people experience. If you leave your car parked in the wrong place, the city will ticket you over and over again until you get towed. If you get pulled over for speeding, just imagine saying, "Officer, you can't give me another ticket. I have 3 from last week that I haven't paid yet." But that is the reality for these large industrial facilities. 3 strikes and then you get warnings. And if you're wondering how the city decides who does and doesn't get this kind of grace, there are no guidelines. It's not a formal policy, just the Department of Public Health deciding who gets a pass and who doesn't. We even found cases where inspectors had issued tickets for what seemed like very clear violations. And the Department of Health chose not to follow through. We also found that after prolonged negotiations, sometimes stretching on for years, during which they are not issuing more tickets, the city regularly settles for inconsequential fines, dropping all charges in exchange. This practice was specifically also called out in the OIG report, which could not recommend further action against Hilco due to the legally preclusive effect of the city settling. So, you might be wondering what we'd like them to do instead. One of our other major findings is that the city has powers that it does not use. For example, the Commissioner of Public Health can issue abatement orders, effectively ordering businesses to halt specific activities or even overall operations until they are able to do so safely. This was also called out by the Inspector General, who noted that the Assistant Commissioner should have escalated these concerns to the Commissioner, who could have issued an emergency abatement order to prevent the demolition. That dust cloud is a strikingly clear example of what an emergency order can prevent. But the Commissioner can also issue non-emergency orders. They can add conditions to annual operating certificates. And that's why our first recommendation is for the city to use the powers that it already has. Attach conditions, issue abatement orders, fine companies for every day they break the law, which is also what is written in the municipal code. And if they keep violating the law, keep citing them for it. Capping the number of tickets is incoherent and unacceptable. We're also calling for the Department of Environment to be restored with a budget of at least twice what it had before, because the climate crisis has continued to intensify, and we have a lot of ground to make up for before we are even approaching a position of having functional environmental enforcement in this city. Furthermore, we need to pass a cumulative impacts ordinance, because if we can't effectively regulate the companies that are being permitted, then we need to stop permitting them, especially when they're being concentrated in areas that are already suffering from an excessive burden of air pollution and environmental harm. We also need to tie city contracts to environmental compliance. If people are doing business with the city, they should be held to the highest standards of environmental compliance. And yet there is no meaningful communication that happens between the Department of Public Health and the Department of Procurement Services to establish whether city vendors are in environmental compliance. This was actually established also during the recent budget hearings, when the heads of those departments were asked about this point blank. And the Department of Procurement Services said that Public Health was responsible for informing them. And the Commissioner of Public Health said that it was an interesting idea, but it's not something that they're doing. And finally, to get at all of this, we need to hold interdepartmental hearings. The City Council needs to have public hearings to demand accountability about what is happening and what has happened, so that we can understand how we got here and what we need to do to make it better. So those are the key findings of our report. And I want to underscore this, like, this is really just us validating what we've already known, right? The people who live next to these facilities have already known that environmental enforcement was ineffective. The people who experienced that dust cloud as a result of that demolition don't need to be told that the city has not been doing its job. But we have now documented this in a way that is quantifiable, and it is time, for the city to reckon with what has been documented, and it's time for this to change. Thank you.